Hey everybody, Jane here, and I am reviewing Heaven and Hell, A History of the Afterlife by Bart D. Ehrman. And this is the first thing I've read by Mr. Ehrman, but I will be reading more of his work. This book was very interesting. So Bart grew up very religious and kind of became a Christian scholar. And he did kind of lose his faith along the way, or seems to have, which is unfortunate. But he talks in this book about some of the things he found and learned as he was studying the origins of the Christian belief in heaven and hell. So he starts with the Greco-Roman view on heaven, hell, afterlife, and what Judaism viewed initially, and then when it fell under the Roman rule, how that probably influenced it, what the common beliefs were at the time of Christ, what became common Christian views, and some of the other views that were held in Christianity, including the idea in certain sects of reincarnation. So that's a lot to take in, but this book was very interesting and very educational to read. At the end of the day, I gave it a 4 out of 5, which for me is above average, but not necessarily a favorite. So I loved that this book was incredibly readable. Nonfiction can be tough to read and can be draggy and dry. I didn't have that issue with this book. I was really able to get through it, understand what he was saying, and I really was engaged with it. I loved the information that was presented, and this is a subject matter that I am very interested in, especially recently. We had a death in our family on New Year's, and ever since then, I've kind of been revisiting. I've been in a spiritual journey for a while now, and I've just kind of been revisiting some ideas and trying to wrap my mind around what I think of all of this stuff. The soul, the afterlife, the big existential questions and thoughts. I do want to talk a little in depth about a couple areas of this and things that I think are important or interesting. I don't really view nonfiction books as having spoilers, but if you don't want to know any more than is this book worth the read, you might want to hop off now. But I definitely think if you're interested in the history of heaven and hell, this is a good starting spot. I would say if you are devoutly Christian and believe that the Bible is the literal word of God, every single sentence, you might have some struggles with this book. This book is not really intended, I don't think, for people like that. If you are more able to see the Bible metaphorically, if you are more able, maybe not a believer, but fascinated by the Christian belief system, this is a very interesting book to pick up. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was, in the beginning of this book, Mr. Ehrman mentions that just because beliefs have evolved doesn't mean they're not true. And he brings up science and our understanding of science and how things that we knew we have built on since then. And I thought that was a very important starting point, is that he tells us in the beginning of the book that he's not trying to discredit heaven and hell or the Bible. He just is saying he thinks these are some of the places that influences happened, and that doesn't mean that it's not correct. And growing up super religious, I think that is a hard concept to wrap my mind around, although I think it's a very good one to have, is that just because beliefs evolve doesn't mean they're right or wrong. You're going to see that with any religion, that it doesn't have the same beliefs at the beginning as it does where you're at in the system. And I'd never looked at it that way of science and health and everything is evolving as we get more information. And possibly the views of the afterlife that Christians now have evolved as they were exposed to new ideas. So I did like that. And I thought that was an interesting way of looking at it, though, again, having been raised really religious, I kind of was like, well, but Abraham and Moses and Adam were supposed to know the truth. So whatever the truth is should have been passed down to the generations of people afterwards. And it's not like God showed up and said, "Hey, by the way, here's heaven and hell." It's in this book, there is very strong influences, and people go, "Huh, I think that makes sense within the context of our belief system." So I do applaud Ehrman for, bringing that up, that just because it might have evolved from other things doesn't make it not true. But also, as somebody who was raised very religious, unless God shows up and tells somebody, "Hey, this is how things are," how does that work? How does saying, "Well, it's not true, it's just an evolution of beliefs"? So I do think there's a little bit of an issue with that. But I liked it at the same time. Like, I liked it, but I think it's logically difficult. So another thing that he talks about is kind of the evolution of the belief that Judaism would continue, that eventually became personal continuance. So apparently, in the old Jewish beliefs, there wasn't really a belief in an afterlife. And I've actually heard that is the case talking or watching documentaries on Jewish beliefs, and reading some of the things I have, that some Jewish faiths don't have a heaven, a hell, or an afterlife. They just, once you're dead, you're dead. But it is interesting to see that the idea that, okay, Judaism will continue to live on, which was a big theme, apparently in the Old Testament, according to what Bart was saying here, it becomes, or could have become, personal salvation instead of just the salvation and continuance of Israel. So I thought that was really interesting. I thought the Greco-Roman influence on the Jews was very interesting, the idea of it. Also the ideas of, okay, Christ came and he probably believed this, and this is kind of what he said. And then we have the additions of Paul, who didn't necessarily believe everything, and it looks like Paul really believed that Christ was going to return in his own time, that he would survive until Christ returned. And the doctrine really changed when they were like, "Hey, Christ will be back, next week," versus thousands and thousands of years in the future. So I thought that was really interesting to compare how the belief system had to change from, we think this is going to happen in our lifetimes, to it's probably going to happen forever in the future. And I know the religion I was raised in, they very much had that belief that, no, Christ is going to be back. He's going to be back in your lifetime. And we were always told that. And it's just interesting to me now that I'm out of that faith that that is a common religious theme, and has been common since the days of Paul. Christ is coming back. He's just taking his time. So I did really appreciate the way that this book brought things together for me and helped me see kind of why changes might have happened and where those changes evolved to, including, in the Greco-Roman traditions, you have an afterlife, but it's not really typically like a punishment and a reward system. It is much more everybody's just kind of hanging out, and they're kind of not really aware of what's going on. Whereas, especially when the Jews were being persecuted, I think there was this idea, he says there's this idea that there should be justice. We're humans and we're big into justice. And if I'm a good person and that person's a bad person, then we shouldn't just walk around together both equally miserable and unmiserable in the afterlife. Because he goes into this view of what Hades was like based on classic literature, and I can't remember what he called them. I think they were shadows or something like that. But they were just souls kind of meandering around, and they didn't really remember who they were. They didn't really interact with people. But, they were still alive, technically. I mean, like, they still existed. You still knew who they were. And sometimes in ancient Greek stories, people could talk to these people in Hades and get information, advice. They were, story tropes in ancient literature. And so the idea that, why should everybody be equal when I'm a good person and that person's not, and that person's hurting my people? So possibly heaven and hell at least partly came about as the idea that there has to be some justice, especially for the Jews who were being seriously persecuted, at the time that this was all going on, and the early Christians who believed, hey, we're being persecuted for our beliefs, but there has to be like a silver lining somewhere, and that silver lining is the idea of heaven, and then the bad guys are going to be punished. So it was really an interesting read, seeing how Christianity probably got to a lot of their beliefs in heaven and hell. It definitely did not in any way influence my beliefs about heaven and hell. But I did want to say too, I wanted to comment about something that the author wrote in an afterwards. And the author, I assume, is now an atheist. I'm not entirely sure. But he believes that after death, it's just lights out, end of story. And he's like, I don't understand why people get so upset and freaked out about that. We didn't exist before. Not existing, I mean, it's not like we'll be upset that we don't exist, we won't exist. And I think I did want to say he is missing, I think, the point that I have anyway of my concern about that. So when it comes to afterlives, if there is nothing, to me, that makes a lot of this life and this suffering kind of pointless. And that's what I struggle with. In some ways, I think it would be the best outcome, because so many people, most people, I believe, are doing their best. And if you have a heaven and hell with rules that nobody understands, it's horrible, the idea that, oh, well, Joe Schmo over there is going to hell because he had coffee this morning. The religion I grew up in, you're not allowed to have coffee or tea. So, I mean, this person is a wonderful, devout Christian, but they can't go to heaven because they have some coffee in the morning, or they have a sweet tea with their lunch. That's kind of ridiculous. But, every religion has different rules and different things that are okay. And even beyond Christianity, what is good? What is bad? What are we trying to work towards? Is eating pork a sin? Is eating, fish or meat on Friday, is that a problem? If you're Catholic, it is. So how do you judge people that it's really truly fair and not just, my God won the race? Because that's not a very fair, just system to me. So I don't love the idea of heaven and hell. Because I think if there's a God and he is fair, then heaven and hell is not fair, because the rules are kind of arbitrary and nobody really knows what rules there are. So I think heaven and hell has a lot of problems if you are talking about potentially a just God. Reincarnation is an interesting concept. Of all of the concepts of afterlife that I would hope for, I think reincarnation would be the one I would be most, open to. But I also know that some people really struggle with life and struggle with suffering, and there is a part of me that says, as hard as life is, would I want to do this again and again and again? Because, you do have wonderful things in life. And I think part of it is I'm getting older. I'm getting a little bit cranky. And when I was in my 20s, I would have told you reincarnation is amazing. I love the idea, because in the 20s, my life was good. It was full of hope. I was going to do all these great things with my life. And now I'm almost 40. And I am very proud of the things I've done. But man, it has been a long road. And it's still a long road. And it's going to continue to be a long road. And I think you just get more aware that life is hard as you get older. And that people are struggling and you're going to have to struggle. So reincarnation, I think, is a nice idea, but then at the same time I'm like, do I really want to go through all of this again? You know, deaths in the family, deaths of people you love, dreams that you thought you were going to make come true that you can't, medical conditions, illnesses, so many things that make me go, do I really want to do all this again? But then again, you have what I think is the most fair is lights out. You know, nobody has to go through all this crazy pain and suffering and difficulty again. Everything's fair. Everybody's lights out. Nobody's rewarded. Nobody's punished. There's no rules. But if that's the case, then what is the meaning of life and how do we deal with understanding suffering in the context of this being it? And not necessarily like everyday suffering. The person in our family who died was older. She'd lived a good life. She had children. She'd had divorces and difficulties and, you know, was widowed from her most recent husband. But, you know, a lot of good and a lot of bad, a very balanced life. But there are a lot of people who are suffering who they don't have that. You know, either they have a chronic illness or, you know, they die as a child or die young, or there's just so many times that suffering is really a problem. And to me, especially when it's not that they died at 80 and they'd had a fairly balanced life. So I really struggle with the idea that it's lights out. And I don't think he understands that the struggle with lights out isn't necessarily that people are afraid to exist or afraid to not exist, but that not existing kind of creates a lack of meaning in this life. And that is something, again, as I struggle to understand my own beliefs, that I struggle with. So this book was very thought-provoking. I really had a good time with it and enjoyed it. I will be reading more from this author. I don't recommend reading, as I said, if you're super religious. At this point, I look at the Bible as a parable of stories, especially the Old Testament. Not necessarily of things that happened, but of stories to teach people about the concepts within Christianity. And I'm not sure if that's the right way to view it or not, but that's kind of where I'm coming from right now. And I think this book kind of comes from a similar place. He does talk about how in the Bible, sometimes we don't know who wrote the book or know when it was written. We don't know how much knowledge the person had. And this is especially true in the Gospels when we are trying to figure out Christ's beliefs. You know, the Gospels are where we have the most information about Christ's life, but we also don't, we don't have anything written by Christ. We don't have anything that we know of that was written by his disciples in the moment. We have books that have come probably 30, 40, 50, 60 years after Christ's death. And they may not be accurate. They may not portray what Christ said. Even somebody quoting him, standing beside him and quoting him and writing down what he said may not be 100% accurate. But to go 60 years and you don't know who's writing it, it's really hard to know what Christ's beliefs were outside of what was likely his beliefs based on what other Jews of the time believed and his in combination with the things that he said. So I did enjoy. I will be reading more. Have you read this book and do you have similar feelings, or did you feel completely different about it? Additionally, have you read other books by this author? I'm really interested in the Misquoting Jesus that's mentioned at the top here. It says best-selling author of Misquoting Jesus. And there was a couple others about the life of Christ that I really wanted to read more. But have you read his other books? And if so, which ones would you recommend? Which ones would you stay clear of? Especially for somebody who is not actively religious. Yeah, so any comments about this would be great. Any other books that are similar, please recommend to me. I'm definitely in a bit of an existential crisis, as I've mentioned, so reading religious books has been something I've been doing so I can try to figure out what my own belief systems are. And again, I don't want to read religious texts because reading religious texts is kind of how I got here in the first place. I actually lost my faith when I was a Sunday school teacher. I was reading the Old Testament and trying to teach it, and basically was like, man, this God, Old Testament God, is kind of awful. And as an ethical person, I don't know if I can worship a God who does the things that Old Testament God did. So it's been a journey, and it's been a journey. So anyway, please give me book recs, and I will talk to you guys next time. This has been Jane. My social media is below if you would like to message me. Please do not try to send me any kind of conversion stuff, because while I respect everybody's religious beliefs and religious journey, somebody believing something is true and knowing in their heart it's true isn't enough to convert me. And yeah, it just don't be that person, please. Also, just so you know, I'm a writer, so if you like to read books, particularly romance, this is not really probably your jam if you're reading or watching a review about a nonfiction religious book, but still, if romance happens to be your jam, check out my books. They are available on Amazon, Smashwords, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and basically anywhere the books are sold. When you buy my books, it helps support this channel, and I truly appreciate it. This has been Jane. Thanks. Bye.